Then I want to just also note that when you go back to the beginning of the pink tide, and we've covered the pink tide a fair amount on this show, and we'll only do so more. I mean, pretty soon we're going to have to do some pretty significant coverage on these new convictions, thankfully in absentia at least, of President Correa, the former president of Ecuador, which in some ways follow a similar script to the charges against Lula. And Cristina de Kirchner, who is Alberto Fernandez's vice president, it's very important to note that she and her husband came into power in a genuine political partnership. Nestor is no longer alive, and really did reverse Argentina's dependence on World Bank and IMF back in the Bush era. And they really did try to reorient the economy in some pretty important ways. And they would probably be, as the sort of left Peronists, not probably the most rightward part of the entire pink tide. And, I would just say that, Cristina Kirchner, like plenty of these other leaders, have just been relentlessly demagogued and smeared in the Western press.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean, I think this is, there's a countervailing tendency where, if somebody's opposed to U.S. interests, we have to sanitize them. We can't have an intellectually rigorous conversation. I think that doesn't work, because I actually mainly, even just frankly, for if you wanted to look at it in terms of propaganda purposes, I don't think that kind of bullshitting about everything works. And I would actually make a really hard and fast distinction, frankly, between the enormous complexity of something like China, which we just need to learn how to be adults about, which is going to push back against the new Cold War, fear-mongering, war-mongering attempt. Also combine the fact that push against China is delusional. I mean, how much are you really going to bully a rising power where your entire supply chain relies on them? And that it is very important to understand how China looks at the world, how they conduct their foreign policy. And then at the same time, I think it's ridiculous and foolhardy to make excuses of where China, abuses rights or whatever else. I just think it's silly. And also you have to look at the entirety of Asia. In the Middle East, there's big variance here in terms of Iran, Syria, wherever else. But, and again, abuses committed by these various governments and leaders like Assad. But the main story is pushing away U.S. interventionism, U.S. imperialism, which is extraordinarily aggressive in the Middle East, obviously. And I would say particularly in Latin America, the distinction I would make is that these governments are not perfect. No government is perfect. But these are still states that are struggling on the periphery to do various forms of social democracy, or in Cuba's case, more full communism. And that has to be innately, that has to be something we're really aligned with. Again, I think we could be politically and ideologically, intellectually coherent. And again, China is very hard to figure out. Obviously, we'll do more coverage on China. I think in the Middle East, I think Iran is fascinating. I've certainly offended plenty of people with some of my defenses with Iran, but Iran is not a left project. It's delusional. Assad is not a left project. In Latin America, these are left projects. And we really need to make that distinction if we're looking from the perspective of any government in the periphery, subject to U.S. imperialism, trying to work out delivery. And that goes for Argentina, it goes for Cuba, it goes for Venezuela.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add specifically to the Latin America dimension too is, look, it's not necessarily saying, for example, that, Fernandez, I said that during the GEM too, that, this is not necessarily some kind of like super radical, socialist project. But what this is very simply is a nation, is a group of people who are being exploited on the international scale, fighting back against that system and not having the ability democratically to make those kind of fundamental decisions that you should be able to make in a democracy, right? If you want to say that we live in a democracy, we want to put the people first, we want to make sure that those are the people getting the funds first, you should be able to do that. But it's really important when you start to take this zoom out and you start to look at the trajectory of history, especially over, at the end of the post Cold War era, is that global finance and international capitalism really have veto power over democracy and loss of
Right.
war. And specifically too in Latin America, in the same way that there are so many deaths just due to colonization and the wickedness, I think it's really important that people understand how severe colonization and the extraction of the continent of Latin America was. There's a really great book, Open Veins of Latin America, that you should definitely check out. It really opened my eyes up, not only just how brutal the colonization was, but actually how integral it was to European capitalism.
Right.
The European capitalism that became the most dominant mode of production in the world could not have existed if it wasn't for the exploitation of the natural resources and the indigenous people in the Americas. The same with African people in Africa and with extraction in Asia. I mean, but these things are very much tied to the success of the capitalist project in Europe and then in the United States. And when we're when we're analyzing what's going on today, it's very important that we can thread those things, because those wounds are so deep, and it's not just psychological. It's just that it's not just psychological. These are still material relationships that continue today, and this exploitation still continues in a very material way.
Absolutely. And the reason that they would have to crush and reverse the pink tide generally is that all of these leaders across the ideological, from kind of center left to soft nationalist populist to much more socialistic, from Ortega to Lula, they want independence. Mm-hmm. And that is fundamentally unacceptable to U.S. foreign policy and to U.S. corporate interests. And also one of the reasons why Venezuela was targeted so aggressively from the beginning is that Chavez, with things like the CARICOM initiative, which implicate the 2010 coup in Haiti and have implication for the movement that was taking place, a year ago and ongoing in Haiti, in terms of basically, Venezuelan next to nothing interest loans that were there to provide poverty relief and development, getting, misdirected by certain members of the government. That what Chavez did and what Venezuela is even still doing today when they get test kits to their neighbors in the Caribbean was say, not only are we going to use our oil revenues, people don't know Venezuela actually already had state oil companies well before Chavez. So it wasn't even just a question of nationalization. It was a question of using it geostrategically to try to create democratic and development alternatives in the Caribbean and Latin America. And that is the geostrategic reason of the U.S. pressure against those states. And it's also another reason, by the way, and people don't like this, but I mean, to the extent China and Russia are present in Latin America, it's extremely beneficial to counteracting U.S. hegemony and pressure. There's states in Asia, I don't look, should we have a war over Taiwan? Of course not. But I'm quite sympathetic to the Taiwanese position in terms of their present reality. And that's where some of these complexities come in.
Yeah.
You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.